It was October of 1890 in Mercy Crossing, Kansas. Ruth Calder stepped onto the ticket stool at 4 minutes past 6 in the morning, opened the glass face of the station clock, and pushed the long hand forward until it stood exactly 2 minutes ahead of railroad time. She checked it against the standard watch in her apron pocket and got down. 11 seconds. She had done it every morning for 6 years. Behind her, the floorboards spoke. A knocking, deliberate and clean, made with the flat end of a carpenter's pencil against the doorframe. Samuel Pike knelt in the opened floor by the freight scale, 3 boards up, the cold smell of earth rising around him. He was a broad man of 36 who moved carefully, the way men do who have learned that other people startle easily. He looked at the clock, then at her. Then he tapped again, slower. "Your clock lies." Ruth felt one corner of her mouth move before she gave it permission. She crossed to her table, laid 2 fingers on the brass telegraph key, hers, worn bright at the knob, the one thing in the station she had bought with her own money, and rapped an answer. Only by 2 minutes. He could not hear the sounder, or not enough to matter. He read her hand instead, the small rise and fall of her wrist, long and short, the way another man reads lips. He nodded once and went back to the floor. She did not explain. He did not ask again that day. Mercy Crossing was 1 room of pine, a platform, a water tank, and 200 yards of siding and grass the color of an old dog. West of the depot, the prairie ran flat 11 miles to Ardell. East of it, the ground dropped into the Sand Creek Draw, where the railroad crossed a timber trestle 400 feet long before climbing toward Pryor Switch. Ruth ran all of it, though nobody had written that down. She was 32, and her title on the payroll was Operator, Second Class, $58 a month. In practice, she kept the register, the freight bills, the mail sack, the switch lamps, and Ben Harlan, who was 19 and could not be kept anywhere. On the shelf beside the clock lay a small brass cattle tag, green at its edges. Ben had asked about it his first week. Ruth said it belonged to her brother. He never asked again. The way freight came in at 10:40, which her clock called 10:42, Ruth entered the true time in the register. The clock was allowed to lie. The book never was. Outside, the freight made the kind of noise that ate words. Ben shouted a question from 3 feet away, and she watched his mouth open and close and got nothing. Samuel came up the platform with a stringer on his shoulder. He needed to know whether the new plank should run under the freight scale or be cut around it, and speech was useless. He set it down and tapped the doorframe with his pencil. "Under or around?" Ruth picked up a pencil of her own and tapped the counter. "Around. Scale comes up in spring." "Good. Faster. For you or for me?" "Both." He went back to work, and nobody noticed that 2 people had just held a conversation through a doorframe. Talking to Samuel Pike was easier when the world was loud. Everything else got harder. He got clearer. Miriam Lowe came over from the post office at noon with the mail sack. She was 50, with an eye that could weigh a parcel within an ounce. "He watches you write in the book," she said, nodding at Samuel. "He watches everything. It's how he hears. Reminds me of the summer of the fire. Not him, the way you were that summer. Checking things." She set the sack on the counter. "I've still got my daybook from that summer." Ruth's pen stopped on the register. "The mail's short 2 sacks. Ardell's holding them." "It's on the shelf where it's always been," Miriam said, and went. 3 days after that, Samuel found the trouble in the floor. Ruth had been sending to Pryor Switch with the freight on the siding when her spacing opened and the man at the far end broke in to ask her to repeat. That had never happened in her life. Samuel had been watching her wrist. He put his palm flat on the floor by her table leg while the freight pumped its air, then crawled under the office and came up with cedar rot on his fingers. He did not say, "Let me fix it." He laid a shaving of pine on the counter and wrote, "A post under your table has rotted off its stone. Your table shakes when you send. May I take up 2 boards?" Ruth read it twice. It was the words, "May I," she read twice. "Yes," she said, facing him. "Take up what you need." It took him a day and a half. A new cedar post on a flat limestone, a joist sistered alongside the old one and drawn tight, the boards back so well you had to hunt for the seam. Then he stood aside and let her try it. She sent a line of practice letters with the freight working the siding. The table did not move. The sounder spoke plainly, and under her forearm the wood carried the clicks into her bones, clean and separate. "I can feel it through the table," she said, surprised into honesty. He read her mouth. "Good wood does that." His voice was low and flat, the voice of a man who could not check himself against the room. "Bad wood just rattles." He picked up his tools. He looked once at the clock. She saw him look, and said nothing, and did not offer to fix one other thing in that station. After that it became a habit, and then it became theirs. The loudest 3 minutes of any day came when a train stood at the tank with its injector on. Nobody could talk through it, so they tapped. Samuel on whatever wood was nearest, Ruth on her key. "Clock still lying." "Still only 2. "You missed a nail by the door." "Left it for you." "Number 6 is late," she tapped one Tuesday. "Not by your clock," he answered, and she laughed out loud on the platform with a full head of steam beside her, and no one heard that either. The things Ruth noticed about him were not the things a woman is supposed to notice first. He never guessed. When he had not understood her, he said so and waited. He asked before he moved anything of hers, down to a borrowed hammer. When the section men talked over him, he took out his rule and went on measuring. He noticed things too, and said so. That she wrote with her left hand while her right stayed on the key. "That's not admiration," Ruth said. "That's inventory." "Same thing," Samuel said, "in my trade." They talked, finally, on a Thursday night in the rain, with the lamp low and the wires quiet. He told her about the rock cut outside Osage in 1886 and the charge that went early, and how for a month the world came to him only as pressure and shape. He had been engaged then to a woman named Alice, who had been kind. That was the part he wanted her to understand. She started answering for me. The doctor asked where it hurt and she told him. A man asked my rate and she gave it. Low. She thought she was carrying something for me. But a year of that and I couldn't find the edge of myself. I'd rather be misunderstood by strangers than spoken for by someone who loves me. Ruth sat with that a while. Then she told him about Aaron. 19, she said. Her brother, 6 years younger and twice as easy with people. June of 1884. At 4 minutes past 4 one afternoon, she took a report off the wire from a foreman west of Ardell. Smoke, grass fire, a southwest wind laying the grass flat. At 10 past 4, she wired Sheldon Vane, the chief dispatcher at Ellis, for leave to warn the section gangs and the men moving stock up the old county road. Vane answered at 7 minutes past 6. Unconfirmed reports were not to be circulated, he said. Alarm cost the company more than fire did. By 7, the fire had crossed the old road at the bend above the draw. They found Aaron there, and 11 head with him. Ruth went back to work 8 days later, and the first morning she set the clock 2 minutes fast. 2 minutes, she said. Somewhere in the middle of those 6, I stopped and read the report through again to be certain. 2 minutes standing still, and I have counted them 1,000 times. Her hand had gone, without her deciding it, to the little brass tag on the shelf beside the clock. I thought if I lived 2 minutes ahead, I'd never spend them again. Samuel did not tell her she was blameless, or that the fire would have come anyway. He let the words sit, then wrote on the back of a freight bill and turned it toward her. That is a heavy way to keep time. Ruth looked at it. He wrote underneath, I won't touch your clock. You could. It'd take you 10 seconds. It isn't mine to set. The middle of October came in dry and blue, the kind of sky that makes people careless. On the 16th, Ruth went out to hang the mail crane and saw a mourning dove come down on the depot eave. It was gray, but not the right gray. smears along its wing, a fine dust in the feathers of its breast. And when she put her hand on the sill and brought it down again, her palm was smudged. Ash. She looked up. Overhead, the sky was clean. One hawk. No cloud in it anywhere. Quick question while the sky's still clear. Where are you listening from, and what are you doing while you listen? Driving, folding laundry, sitting up late? Tell us in the comments. Now, back to Mercy Crossing. Samuel came around the corner of the platform and stopped when he saw her face. He looked at her palm, then stepped into the grass, turned square to the wind, and stayed there with his eyes half shut and his chin lifted. South, he said. Long way south. The smell's thin. It's been in the air an hour. He wet a finger. Wind's steady. It'll run to the Smoky Hill and drown. It did. Word came up the wire that evening. 40 miles down, 1,100 acres, stopped at the water, nobody hurt. But every soul between Ardell and Pryor Switch went to bed knowing the country was loaded. Calvin Mercer arrived on the eastbound local 5 days later with a leather case and a schedule inspector's authority to close the place. He was 44, courteous and thorough, and Ruth disliked him within the hour for a reason she could not put in the log. He asked her a question about her own order book, then turned while she was answering and asked Ben the same question. He did it twice more before supper. He copied her register back 4 months. He was not cruel about it. He was worse. He was reasonable. 19 passengers a week, he told her on the third evening. Ardell is 11 miles west, Pryor Switch 13 east. The division could serve this ground with 2 men instead of 4. He tapped his pencil on her counter, and she noted sourly that he had no idea what he was doing with it. Rules aren't written for good operators, Miss Calder. They're written because a man who thinks he knows better than the schedule is the commonest cause of a funeral in this business. And an operator who sees what the dispatcher can't? Reports it, Mercer said, and waits. He drew out his watch, squared it against her station clock, frowned, and wrote a line in his notebook. Station clock 2 minutes fast. Deficiency. 1 unauthorized stop, he said, closing the book. 1. That's a discharge, and it's the argument that closes this station. I'd rather write neither. The letter from Superintendent Ray came on the 4th morning of the audit, while Mercer sat at the far end of the office with her registers. Chief Operator's Desk, Denver, opening in January. $90 a month, a city, a title, 4 men under her, conditional on a clean record and a favorable report from the schedule department. Ruth read it 4 times, then handed it to Samuel because she wanted to, which surprised her. He read it slowly and set it down. You should think about that seriously. I am. I want to say something once and not say it again. He waited until she was looking at him. I'll never ask you to stay here for me. If a woman gives up her work to prove she loves a man, he's got the proof, and she's got nothing. He picked up his hat. There's bridges in Colorado, too. It was the most respectful thing anyone had ever said to her, and she lay awake half that night sick with the fear under it. That a man who would never ask you to stay might be one who had never pictured you there. The 27th of October came in warm and wrong. Mercer had 3 days of copying left and no intention of hurrying. The storm stood up over the North Ridge at 6:30, all shoulders and no rain, and threw dry lightning onto the grass for an hour. By 8, there was a red seam under the cloud that was not lightning. By 8:30, ash was coming down in flakes the size of a thumbnail, and Ruth had the barrels filled and the grass wet. The wind had been out of the north, which meant the fire was walking toward the railroad and would meet the plowed break west of the tank. At 20 minutes to 9, the wind backed into the northwest and came up hard. Samuel was at the tank. Ruth watched him stop dead, drop to one knee, and put his hand flat on the boards. Then, he walked to the east end and stood 4 full minutes with his back to her, turning slowly. When he came in, his face had changed. The head's gone east, he said. It's in the draw. How can you know that? He took her wrist, the first time he had ever touched her, turned her palm up, and dropped into it a curl of ash. It was black. It held its shape, and when she closed her fingers, it smeared oily. That's not grass. Grass ash goes to powder. That's timber, pitchy timber. And there's no timber in this county but cottonwood in the bottom and 400 feet of trestle over Sand Creek. He was talking too loud, the way he did when he was afraid and did not care. 3 years of tumbleweed packed against those bents, and the creek's been dry since August. From the rails, you'd see nothing. Deck sound, rails sound. It's under the deck that burns, and it burns quiet. Ruth was already at the table, calling prior switch. Nothing. She called again. The dead nothing of an open circuit, then a hiss and crackle as the storm static came down the wire like sand through a chute. Ardell answered on the fourth call, thin as a voice through a wall, and lost her mid-word. Ben, cut the east wire out at the board and put 4 more cells on. Now! Calvin Mercer had been at the far end of the counter since supper, in his shirt sleeves. He looked at the ash and the red under the cloud, and he was not a fool. His face was gray. Number 4, Ruth said. Eastbound Express. Due Ardell 9:34, on the trestle at 9:56. I want it stopped at Ardell. On what confirmation? On the ash in my hand. Miss Calder, he said it carefully. Prior switch is silent. There's no foreman's report and no dispatcher. You're asking me to stop a first-class train on a carpenter's opinion of a smell. He says, Ruth began and stopped. Samuel stood 3 feet away, watching her mouth. He had heard none of it. She put a message blank and a pencil into his hands, then turned Mercer by the shoulder until he faced Samuel. Ask him. Look at him while he answers, Mercer asked. Samuel answered in speech, then in pencil, block letters, a cross-section of a bent drawn beside them with the fire's line marked in. Mercer read it twice and did not interrupt. Then he said, I still can't authorize it. I'm not asking you to authorize anything, Ruth said. And then she stopped. Her hand was over the key and it would not come down. It was all there at once, in the exact shape of the other time. The wire uncertain, a man with a title telling her to wait, the certainty in her chest with nothing official behind it. If I am wrong, she thought, they close this station, Ben loses his place, Denver is gone, and I have proved every man who ever spoke over me right. She had spent 6 years buying herself 2 minutes, and now she was going to spend them standing still, exactly as before. Except that was not what had happened before. She saw it plainly, for the first time in 6 years. She had not been late. 4 minutes past 4, the report. 10 past 4, her wire to Ellis. 6 minutes, and the 2 she had spent making certain were part of the work, not a failure of it. Aaron had not died because Ruth Calder was slow. He had died because a man with a bigger desk read her warning and did not answer for nearly 2 hours. The delay had never been hers. Her fingers came down on the brass. She called Ardell 3 times, identified Mercy Crossing, and sent the warning fast and clean, with the storm chewing every letter, and Ben at the board behind her, clamping a copper jumper across a burned contact and setting fresh cells in 2 at a time. Danger! Sand Creek trestle burning underneath. Stop number 4 at Ardell. Do not let her pass. She could not hear the answer. The static had the sounder buried. So she laid her forearm flat on the table Samuel Pike had made still, the cedar post on its limestone, the joist drawn up tight, and read Ardell's repeat through her own bones, letter by letter, out of good wood. They repeated it back, every word, and told her the red board was going up. Ruth acknowledged and wrote down the hour, 9:26. Then she opened the station log and entered all of it. The ash, the wind, the message, the hour in true railroad time. She signed it twice, once with the initials she used on 100 messages a day, and once with her name in full. Behind her, Mercer said quietly, "You understand what you've just done." Yes, Ruth said, and turned the log around so he could read it. Write it up honestly. That's all I want from you. Samuel already had the red lantern off its hook. He caught her eye, held it up, and pointed east. If the hold failed, somebody had to be on that grade with a red light, west of the bridge, where an engineer could see it. She could have told him not to go. She thought about it for a second. Instead, she said, 2 miles out there's a cut bank. Stand west of it, not in it. Take Ben's horse. Samuel read her mouth, nodded once, and was gone. The next 20 minutes were the longest of Ruth Calder's life, and nothing in them was dramatic. Ben's fingers were black from the burned contact, and he did not mention it. Miriam crossed from the post office and filled lamps without being asked. At 9:38, Ardell came through strong enough to hear, "Number 4 stopped at Ardell. Red board." Ruth put her head down on her arm for one breath. Then she sat up and began writing. At 2 minutes past 10, the floor moved. It was not a sound exactly. It came up through the boards and the cedar post and the table into her elbows. One long shudder, and a low thump she felt behind her ribs. Miriam's lamp chimney rang. Out on the grade, a little over 2 miles east, Samuel Pike felt it come up through the ground into his boot soles and knew what it was. The fire had eaten through the bents under the center span of the Sand Creek trestle, and the span came down 40 feet into the dry creek bed, and there was no train on it, and no man on it, and nobody died at Mercy Crossing that night. Ellis confirmed the hold at 20 minutes to midnight when the wire came back. By then, it had stood better than 2 hours on her word alone. The investigation ran 3 days in early November. Superintendent Ray, a claims agent from Ellis, and Calvin Mercer with his notebook. They walked the ruin with Samuel, who showed them the char on the standing bents and explained why the deck had looked sound from above until it wasn't. The claims agent wrote down every word and never once talked over him. They read Ruth's station log and the entry with her whole name under it. On the second morning, Miriam Lowe came through the door with a canvas-bound daybook from 1884 and set it on the table with the flat of her hand. Sheldon Vane's report says the warning reached Ellis at 7 minutes to 6, she said, and opened the book to a page gone soft as cloth. Ruth Calder handed me a written notice for the mail wagon at 4:15, and I logged it. She'd already sent it by wire. She came to me because she didn't trust the wire alone. Ray looked at the page a long moment. Vane wrote down the hour he wished he'd got it. 2 hours, said Miriam, and not one of them was hers. Ruth did not cry. She went out onto the platform, stood in the cold a while, then came back in and asked the claims agent if he wanted fresh coffee. On the third morning, she laid 3 pages of ink across the counter to Ray and read them aloud so there could be no mistake. Mercy Crossing to remain open as the division's telegraph training station, 4 students a term. Herself as station agent and instructor in telegraphy, on the payroll, by name. Authority, entered in the division book, for the operator on duty to signal a train to stop when a structure east or west was reported unsafe. $90 a month, the same as Denver. And Denver declined, by her, that morning, before anyone could decide it for her. Ray read it twice and looked at Mercer. "I'd amend one thing," Mercer said. "Any emergency signal given under this rule to be entered in the station log within 10 minutes over the operator's call and full name." He set the pages down, as she did. "That was already my habit." "Then it costs you nothing," said Mercer, "and it costs me the argument, which is the part I mind." He wrote his department's approval at the foot of the page. Ray signed above it. Samuel Pike received a contract that same week to inspect every timber structure between Ellis and the state line, at a rate he named himself, and did not lower. On the last evening of the investigation, Ruth wrote on the back of a message blank and slid it across to him. "Not asking me to stay isn't the same as saying you want a future. Which is it?" Samuel read it twice. Then he went out to his tool chest and came back with a shaving of pine, because the paper on that counter was the railroad's, and this was not the railroad's business. He wrote, "I'd like to be where you are, not instead of your work, beside it. I didn't ask before because asking you to stay felt too much like choosing for you." Ruth took the pencil out of his hand, which she had wanted to do for a month, and wrote, "Yes, on those terms and no others." In April, the classroom at Mercy Crossing held 4 students, a blackboard, and 2 telegraph desks. Samuel had built the second desk over the winter out of quarter-sawn oak, with a shelf beneath for practice sets and a top so true you could feel a light hand sending from the far end. Ben Harlan had passed his examination in February and taken the night trick at Ardell. Miriam had opinions about wedding dates. Samuel had asked her to marry him in December, in pencil, on pine, and she had answered on the back of a message blank, which is how they settled most things. They had set no date and did not intend to until they wanted one. They had discussed that part exactly once, in about 4 minutes, and agreed so completely that the subject became dull. On a bright morning at the end of that month, Ruth Calder stepped onto the ticket stool, opened the glass face of the station clock, and moved the long hand back 2 minutes. She set it by the standard watch in her pocket and got down. It took her 11 seconds, and it was the hardest thing she did that year. Samuel was at the new desk with a chisel in his hand. He had watched all of it and had not moved to help. He set 2 fingers on the oak and tapped. "Our time?" Ruth crossed the room, laid her hand on the brass key, worn bright at the knob, still the only thing in that station she had bought with her own money, and answered him. "Ours." For 6 years she had tried to stand 2 minutes ahead of the world, as though grief were a train she could outrun by leaving early. What the work asked of her was smaller and harder, to speak at the moment speaking was needed, and to sign her own name underneath it.